Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched Last Night in Soho from 2021. This is a film I have had my eye on, primarily because it is written and directed by Edgar Wright, who I feel like I've talked about at some point or another, but couldn't place exactly which video I would have talked about him in. He is a writer and director who I greatly enjoy, but some of his more recent offerings have been, different. Not that I don't enjoy them, but they've been a little bit more of a departure from his typical fare. He's probably best known for the Cornetto trilogy. I always like the films that he makes, but more recently, some of them have felt a little bit shallow in certain aspects. Prior to this, actually, I'm not sure the order of things, but I think the most recent, or one of the more recent things he made was Baby Driver, that got some reasonably wide acclaim, but I also felt, spoilers, similarly to this one, was a little bit lacking in some departments. I still really like that film quite a lot, and I think I like this film quite a lot as well. But it's definitely something different. This is an interesting sort of psychological throwback movie with a framing device that I didn't really expect, and a tone and genre mixing that I didn't expect either. In particular, there's a particular moment in the film as well where you can sort of see it trending one way, and then there's one scene about 2/3 through that really takes a different kind of turn. Not one that's entirely surprising, but that is certainly different than what I had anticipated up to that point. And has made this film a little bit harder to digest as a result. It is about a young woman in modern times who is from the countryside in Britain and ends up going to school in North London, and is subject to quite a lot of culture shock. However, that's not really the story. Neither is the secondary story, which is about how she has some nostalgic feelings about London because she's been there once and her mother died young, and it was just, the shock of the big city and some mental health issues that have also been transmitted through the family are like some element of it, but that's not the story either, which is very weird. And the list goes on of all these other threads in the movie that are technically not really what the movie is about, or not what the movie is ultimately about. The film is really well produced. This is unsurprising for me, especially from Edgar Wright. Edgar Wright's directorial skills are pretty excellent in general. I think he has a lot of flexibility as a director, to mix and match genres and styles, and I think that's works really well in this film, which has a modern component with the main character and her friends in modern London, and filming a variety of different events and places and things that happen in that setting, while also having a what might be called a flashback, substantial amount of flashback section to the same area in the 1960s, which is literally and figuratively colored by bright lights and the big city and showbiz and you know, all the good and bad that goes with that. Um, but none of that really directly influences the main plot, which is following this secondary character, played by Anya Taylor-Joy, who is this character from the 1960s era, who we get to see have sort of an arc of her own. I'm going to be try and do my best to be careful and not spoil anything here, but there are some elements that may be hard to talk around, so I may have to pause for a moment and collect myself. The main arc of the story really, or at least the one that the film ends on, weirdly doesn't seem to settle in until about halfway to 2/3 of the way through the movie. There is some setup prior to that. I would say the setup begins in the first third, and it is relatively subtle, and ramps up after that through the second third, and then really takes the reins of the film in the last act. And unfortunately, I think it does a disservice to all the other good that is happening in this film. There's a lot of really good stuff going on in here, not just in the cinematography and the direction and the performances, which are all really excellent, and especially the costumes, which are really wonderful. It is very disappointing in how it doesn't leverage some of those elements for its core story. The styles of Soho in the 60s are fully on display, and our main character in the modern setting is an aspiring fashion designer. But that has almost no bearing on the plot. It is a visual element only, and isn't even really reflected in the parallel story going on in the 60s. So other than being a tie between these two characters and these two timelines, and in a sort of cursory way of, she sees these things and they inspire her designs that she's making in the modern time. It doesn't really go much further than that, which is a shame because clearly so much work was put into the designs and costuming and stuff like that. There's a lot of powerful aesthetic choices that really don't go much deeper than aesthetic. And in a way, it sort of seems to squander the whole setting of the time period and the visuals of that time and place. And ultimately, I don't think the two stories tie together all that well. What I'm gonna say some very minor spoilers here, I think, that just to talk about what does and doesn't work narratively as well, or what's completely absent, is that there's this through line in the first third of the film about the main character having her mother who passed away when she was young. Her mother had mental illness. She also has mental illness and has she has hallucinations and things like that. Doesn't really do anything in the story either. It is a way of sort of hand waving some of the dream state stuff or possible hallucination stuff that is otherwise unexplained. It's sort of a wishy-washy way of saying there's of explaining away this supernatural element. It doesn't, though, because the part of this main plot is that she's having memories of the past, that she isn't like learning through some other some other form. It's not like she's reading something in reading something or finding out something in her waking life and then either going to sleep or not going to sleep and having hallucinations and then like imagining what that was like. It is entirely provided through this supernatural element, and it feels almost offensive to equate the, oh, her mom had hallucinations and she has hallucinations, and therefore it's totally explicable that this narrative about how she's the only one who can see and also read the past, to know about these things that happened. It's very it it doesn't it's not offensive, I guess. It's just it's kind of wishy-washy, and they don't tie it together narratively in a way that is very satisfying or validates making that narrative choice to even explain it. I think they could have omitted that entirely. They could have completely omitted the mother storyline, and they could have completely omitted the mental illness element of both her and her mother's storylines. And I don't think it changes anything at all. It would only require a few more lines here or there to say, oh, well, part of the reason the character likes this era and has this nostalgic feeling about the 60s is because her mother would have been there, and she grew up with older people in her family who were also nostalgic for that time and place, and who she grew up kind of isolated, both being in the country and being with people of a much older generation, and have cultural memory. She as a result has a different sort of cultural view than a lot of her contemporaries when she's going to London. She is in many ways a fish out of water. But again, that whole storyline about her feeling outcast, her feeling like she doesn't fit in or she's uncomfortable, is really barely a story. It's more just a narrative setting. And it really doesn't do a whole lot, especially because it pretty explicitly gets washed away as the narrative changes, as the narrative focus changes. Those elements of her personality sort of just disappear. And I think it's waved away as, oh, she's been there a little while now and she's a little more comfortable. But it just raises the question why it doesn't need to be there, basically. I don't remember who it's attributed to, but of course the classic line about how a story is finished when there's nothing left to take away. And so it feels like an extra element that doesn't, there feels like this film is full of elements that don't need to be there in order to tell the story it ultimately ends up telling. So I feel like I'm being very hard on it because I still, in a lot of ways, really like this film. The direction is excellent. Visuals are largely really good. The acting and the performances, the casting is really, really good. Anya Taylor-Joy has a limited, sort of a limited role, but is solid in that. I really like Thomasin McKenzie, the main character. I feel like I've seen her in something before, but I was checking her filmography, and she's been in a couple of things I've meant to watch, but that I haven't watched yet. So I don't know why she seems familiar, but she's excellent. She plays does some very subtle character acting that I really enjoy, very believable. Matt Smith, I know people have feelings about him because he was Doctor Who for a while. I think he is pretty exemplary in this, in the character that he needs to play. I imagine if I had more of an impression about him based on having watching Doctor Who or watching anything else he's been in, I might have a different kind of feeling or a more of a bias, but I think his character is great. And all of the other more minor characters are great as well. This was Diana Rigg's last movie, and I think she does a great job. She passed away before it was released, actually. And then one of the other minor characters, the chemistry between I'm gonna get the names, the character names, or I don't even remember. So Thomas and Mackenzie, and then this other character, whose last name I'm gonna butcher, Michael Ajao or Ahao, Ajao. I don't know how to pronounce that. Who I swear I've seen in something, and he was okay. Minor tangent. He was in Attack the Block, and Attack the Block is a great movie that nobody has seen. And I don't remember if maybe I've mentioned Attack the Block before. Attack the Block is great. And if you haven't watched that, you should. He was in that. I don't know if I actually recognize him from that or if I think I do, but he has an excellent performance throughout this whole film. And I really like the chemistry, between him and Thomas and Mackenzie. They are great on screen together. Every scene with the two of them, or with the two of them and other people, is really wonderful. I really enjoy it. So tons of great performances. I'm not even going to complain that much about the dialogue. I think the dialogue is actually really solid. Some of it is exemplary, in fact, especially in some of the flashback elements. But overall, the writing has these problems with these through lines that don't finish or aren't the focus. And it doesn't seem like they're deliberate misdirects either. They're just not right. They don't not belong, but they're making the story messy as a result. Okay, more of a. I'm going to talk a little bit more spoilers here. I'm still not going to talk about the plot itself, but I am going to have sort of a tonal spoiler for some of the changes in the latter half or the last third. So you've been warned from here. The twist of the last third, that it turns into more of a horror movie. It's less of a creeping horror and more of a it's less of a psychological horror and more of a supernatural and like visual horror, is actually really well done. And I would kind of like to see Edgar Wright do a full-on horror movie, which I don't think this quite qualifies as. But again, because of the messiness of the first half or first 2/3, I feel like the heavy horror stuff that edges into being highly camp towards the end, it works tonally, but it's a little underwhelming, and I don't think the narrative comes to a super interesting conclusion. A satisfying one, yes, but not the most interesting one. And it makes me wish that the horror element had kicked in earlier, as this was more of a development of a mystery story. Instead, the first half of the movie is mostly about sort of almost wallowing in a nostalgia for an era that never really existed, an imagined version of a time and place that ignores all of the problems of that time and place. And so it would be much more interesting to me to see the main character have more reflections on it earlier and be like, oh, this isn't quite what I imagined it was like, or this is darker or dirtier than I thought, and become sort of, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Uh, um, oh, it's like she doesn't look at it with rose tinted glasses anymore. It's fuck. Anyway, uh, so she sort of gets a more realistic view of it, and then it develops into more of a mystery, and she's curious and she's doing research, and then it becomes more of that horror nearer the end. That would lead in much more cleanly in a way that I think would work really well and would be much more satisfying when the horror elements are reflected upon the real world and you understand where these memories, these hallucinations, whatever they are coming from in terms of the real story versus the imagined story versus what she's pieced together as a result of research. Instead, we sort of get it ends up being kind of unsatisfying because the conclusion happens to her rather than her finding it. And it doesn't, it ends up with sort of this very saccharine ending that everything wraps up kind of cleanly rather than, I'm realizing as I'm discussing this, what I actually kind of want is something closer to the girl with the dragon tattoo. Where it is a little bit darker, it's a little bit more like the intensity ramps up as the film goes on, but it's a lot of it is about the investigation and an implied tension, an implied horror, rather than overt horror. It's also interesting to me because Edgar Wright has certainly dabbled in horror elements in several of his films. I've always found them a little bit unsatisfying, and it's usually because he doesn't go full bore on them. But also because pretty much everything that Edgar Wright makes is at least somewhat sarcastic and like somewhat humorous. Some of his stuff is very humorous. It's overtly comedic. But I sort of this movie unfortunately rides a fine line where that I don't think it should be riding, where it's not quite campy enough to ease you into the horror with comedy aspects, but it's also not full on horror. So there are beats in these horror these horror scenes that's like, oh, that's kind of funny, and it breaks it up. And I don't think that's appropriate in this film, or if it could be if they went that way, but you have to make other elements a little bit lighter in order to be complementary. So ultimately, does it make a good film? Yeah, it's pretty all right. I think it has got a lot of really redeeming elements that the performances, all these things that I talked about that I really like, I would still be very complimentary of. I'm disappointed in these certain things, and I wish I could see a different version of the film that got some more rewriting or something like that. It's just missing something. It's missing a final pass. It's missing some polish, some tightening, and I don't think it quite comes together as it needs to pick a lane of tone a little bit better than it does. And that could go one of several ways and work any of those ways. But as a result, I think it's a little bit muddled. So yeah, is it bad? No, not by any means. It's a bit disappointing, but I generally do still like it. And if anything I've talked about sounds like it's something you're interested in, then I do pretty highly recommend it, I suppose. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.